با سلام به همه دوستان، امیدوارم حالتون خوب باشه و زندگی بر وفق مرادتون باشه. امروز میخوام ویدئوی کامل سخنرانی پروفسور جردن پیترسون رو که تقریبا 2 سال پیش اگه اشتباه نکنم توی اسرائیل انجام داده براتون پخش کنم. ویدئو رو به صورت کامل میذارم. قبلش هم نیازی نیست توضیح بدم. اگه توضیح خاصی فکر میکنین میخواین یا ایشون رو نمیشناسین، به ویدئوی قبلی که چند روز پیش گذاشتم توی همین کانال و عکس معذرت میخوام آقای دکتر روش هست، میتونین مراجعه بکنید. میخوام ویدئو رو به صورت کامل بذارم، ولی طبق روال قبل یه چند ثانیه، شاید 30 ثانیه منو کنار ویدئو تحمل بکنید و بعد من میرم و ویدئو رو به صورت تصویر کامل میبینید. یعنی کل سفر میشه ویدئوی سخنرانی آقای جردن پیترسون. بعدش هم نخواهم اومد برای اینکه میخوام خود ویدئو باشه، بعدا خواستین استفاده بکنی کسی بتونه استفاده بکنه. توی برنامه هست که بعدا این ویدئو و ویدئوهای مشابه رو مثل اون ویدئویی که توی پست قبلی گذاشتم و حرفای تاکی کالسون هست راجع به ترانسجندریزم، اگه عمری باشه بشینیم مثل ویدئوهای قدیم که توی همین کانال هست مال چند ماه پیش، قسمت یه بررسی بکنیم. ولی این قسمتی که الان دارم پست میکنم فقط ویدئوی سخنرانی جردن پیترسون هست در اسرائیل، بدون توضیح و برداشت آزاد. هر کی هر چی دلش میخواد میتونه برداشت کنه. ویدئوهای دیگه آقای جردن پیترسون خیلی جا هست و همه جا داره پخش میشه، ولی این ویدئو رو شما اینجا نمیبینید. زیرنویس فارسیشو کار اختصاصی فانوسکسته، البته من انجام ندادم، دادم انجام دادن برام و توی بایکانیم بوده و امروز براتون میذارم. 2 دقیقه حرف زدم، بریم با هم ویدئو رو ببینیم و من پلیش میکنم اینجا. 30 ثانیه حدودا این بغل هستم و بعد از خدمتتون مرخص میشم. ادامهش میتونید کل ویدئو رو ببینید. برقرار باشید. اگه دوست داشتین کامنت و لایک هم یادتون نره و اگه سابسکرایب هم نکردین تا الان سابسکرایب بکنید. ممنونم. مراقب خودتون باشین. خداحافظ.
Okay, so I thought I would talk about 3 things tonight, responding to the previous 2 speakers. I'd like to talk about stories. I'd like to talk about unity. And I'd like to talk about responsibility. I'll talk about responsibility in relationship to something like sacrifice. So let's start by talking about stories. So I think the most fundamental discovery of the last 75 years on the cognitive perceptual front, and that would include, in some strange way, the domain of literary analysis, including postmodernism and also artificial intelligence, the construction of autonomous robots, which you may notice aren't here yet. There's been a convergence of both investigation and conclusion on those fronts, I would say. In some sense, because all of those disciplines ran into the same problem head on, pretty much at the same time. And that was something like the problem of perception. And the problem of perception is a very deep problem. And it's a problem that undermines the objectives of both pure rationalism and pure empiricism. And so you'd say, in some sense, it undermines the claim to totality that's part and parcel of an overextended scientific enterprise. The problem is this: the world appears to be too complex to perceive. And so, if you look at any, even single object, although it appears to you as a unity, if you analyze it in its totality, it's composed of a multitude or even an infinite of subsidiary unities, and it's in a context of an equal number of unities above and beyond it in almost an infinite array. In short, there's almost an infinite number of ways to perceive a particular object. Now, it seems self-evident to us because all we have to do is look at the world and there the objects are, but you have to understand that a huge part of your unconscious cognitive processing is devoted, we'll concentrate on visual perception, to visual perception. It's a very neurologically intensive process. So part of the way that you solve that on the visual front, because it's particularly intensive visually, is that you only have a very small part of your visual field that's high resolution. It's called the fovea. And each cell in the fovea is connected to 10,000 cells in the primary visual cortex, and each of those to 10,000 more cells. And that kind of exponential increase adds up to a very large number of cells. So if you wanted all your vision to be as intensely high resolution as the center point of your vision, which is what you point at the world constantly, bit by bit, partly unconsciously when things attract your attention, and partly consciously when you direct your attention. If your whole visual field was as intensely high resolution as your fovea, you'd have to have a head like a space alien just to keep all the brain functional. And so you could imagine doing something. Imagine that you were trying to paint a photorealistic representation of a single cup and a flower on a table. You think of all the hours you'd have to spend doing that, capturing, say, all the reflections in the glass, in the cup, all the subtle play of light, and how that would transform across the day too. So you'd have to stabilize the lighting, you'd have to stabilize the conditions exactly so that that object would remain constant enough so you could attend to it for the hours or dozens of hours or weeks or even months that it would take to portray it in all of its detail. Because everything is singular in some real sense as well as universal. And so the problem of perception is a major problem, and it's associated with this problem of a plenitude of underlying facts. We should let the facts guide us. No problem. Which facts? Oh yeah, that's a problem. Because there's an infinite number of facts. It's not just a little problem, it's a big problem. And so when robotics engineers started to design systems that could act in the world, they started to design systems that could perceive the world, and then they found out that that was just impossible. They had absolutely 100% no idea how to crack that, because all the obvious boundaries between things and all the obvious reasons that objects seem self-evident to us aren't there in any simple sense in the world. Partly it's because we map functional utility onto objects, and so we actually don't perceive objects. We perceive meanings and infer objects. And meanings are only relevant to something that's deeply embodied, or maybe even something that's alive, or maybe even something that has a soul, who knows. So when I see this, it's a speaker, and the reason for that is because sound comes out of it and I can hear the sound. And when I perceive that, it's something I can sit on. That's why a beanbag and a stump can both be a chair, despite sharing virtually no objective features in common, apart from the fact they're both made of matter, which isn't really much of a commonality. And so you can sit on a stump and you can sit on a beanbag, and therefore they're both chairs, and I suppose those tables could be chairs too, because you can sit on them. There's a functional element to object perception, and it's not secondary. It's not like you see the object and then infer the function, because the way your nervous system is set up, the fovea pattern recognition systems map directly onto the motor output systems even before they map onto conscious vision. And so there are people who are blind who tell you they can't see anything, but if you put up your hand in front of them and you ask them to guess which hand is up, they can guess with 90% accuracy. And they also respond psychophysiologically to flashed faces that show, say, facial expressions associated with anxiety or fear or pain. And so they can't see, but their eyes can map the meaningful patterns of the world onto their bodies. And our visual systems are complexly layered like that. They map onto us at multiple levels of analysis. And so we have to see the world. We see the world as a meaningful place. We see the world as a meaningful place before we see the world as a world of objects. Now that's something. If it's true, that's something. And then you might ask, well, what is the structure of meaning through which we see the world? And that's the next question. What is the structure of meaning through which we see the world? And the answer to that is, that's what a story describes. And that's why we love stories, because seeing the world so we can navigate through it, let's say, seeing the world so that we can make our way forward, we can participate in the ex hodos, the way forward, let's say, means we have to see the world through a story. Now, the postmodernists figured that out, and that's part of why their critique of science is actually quite devastating. Because they did make the claim in some real sense that the scientific narrative, the scientific process, has to be nested in an underlying narrative. And that turns out, I would say, to be true. So 2 thumbs up, perhaps, to the postmodernists for that discovery. Where they went wrong, and very deadly wrong, and politically wrong, and wrong in an intellectually prideful manner, I would say, is they failed to notice the magnitude of the mystery they had discovered, which is, for example, that any given text is susceptible to an infinite number of potential interpretations, which is a postmodern claim, leading to the idea, for example, that it's very, very difficult to assemble anything like a canonical set of books, because if one text is susceptible to a multitude of interpretations, then certainly a canon of texts is susceptible to an even larger multitude of interpretations. And so then you might say, well, which interpretation is canonical? Which is the argument of every argument, right? Which text is canonical? That's the core of every argument. If you can't solve that for a paragraph or a single text, how can you solve it for a canon? And the postmodernists, allied in some sense with the Marxists, and for many of the same reasons, the desire to bring the margin to the center, let's say, jump to the conclusion that the narrative that we impose upon the world, and always have, is one that is nothing but the expression of naked power. Right? We hear that all the time. It's all about power. It's all about power. What's history? Well, it's a power dynamic. It's a power dynamic between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It's a power dynamic between competitors in the economic environment. It's all power between men and women. It's all power. That's history explained in one term. What's the present like? It's all power. It's all domination. It's all oppression. It's all victimization. It's all naked power. That's convenient for you if you want to express power, because if that happens to be the ethos by which you live, then why wouldn't you use power to put yourself forward in the world? If that's the landscape itself, and that's the fundamental Marxist narrative, but not only the Marxist narrative, it's a deeper story than that. I would say Marxism is a branch of the claim that the proper rule of the world is the spirit of power. And that's wrong. And not only is it wrong, technically, and it is wrong technically, it's also wrong morally. It's wrong technically because those creatures, including non-human creatures, who rely on power to attain prominence or status, do that in a very unstable and inefficient manner. Why unstable? Those who live by the sword die by the sword. And Franz de Waal, who studied behavior in chimpanzees, our closest primate relatives, has showed very clearly that the most successful alpha males are not the ones who use dominance and force, but the ones who engage in the most reciprocal activity and are the best at peacemaking. And so much for the biological argument. And then on the human front, there is a subset of people who rely on power to maneuver their way through lives, and those people are called psychopaths. And I'm not kidding. That's exactly, precisely accurate, because for a psychopath, there's nothing but his own narrow, immediate self-interest, and you are there to serve that function, and that's that. And then you might say, well, how successful are psychopaths? And maybe you're cynical and you say, well, everyone who's successful in business and politics is a psychopath. And then I might say, well, to the degree that you're successful, is that because you're a psychopath? And if it's not true for you, well, maybe it's not true for them either. Now, it is true upon occasion for a small subset of people, and that stabilizes at somewhere between 1% and 5% of populations, biologically speaking, with the mean around 3%. And what seems to happen is that if the number of psychopaths falls below to about 1%, everybody forgets they exist and they become incautious and allow them to proliferate, and then they can raise up to about 5%, and then everybody starts to see that the psychopaths are coming out of the woodwork and, hits them back with sticks, and then they fall back to 3%. But if 97% of the world's population, the world's individuals, are making their way through life on non-psychopathic principles, then there's no way that you can say that psychopathy and the power drive that drives it is a successful strategy. It's not. And so it's not power, so it's wrong technically. Now, de Waal has also shown that chimpanzee males who use power to to dominate their hierarchy are very much likely to meet an extremely violent end and who have very short lives. And if you know anything about the history of tyrants, you might derive precisely the same conclusion. Then you might ask yourself as well, if you want to have a successful relationship with your wife and husband, are you going to base that on power? So one of you is a tyrant, one of you is a slave, and that's supposed to be the recipe for a stable, iterating, reciprocal relationship that lasts decades? Good luck. Try it out. See how well it works. If you're a man, you're going to find that women aren't that easy to oppress. And if you're a woman, you're going to find that if you're an utter tyrant in your feminine way and you demand too much, all you'll do is demoralize your man to the point where you won't want to sleep with him, and that you'll feel that you're in your own special kind of well-deserved hell. And so it's not the basis for a stable relationship, and that's partly, and this is also extremely important. You imagine that there might be one rule that would govern our interactions if we only had to interact once. And that rule might be, I can dominate and win. I never see you again. I can take everything you have, and that's the end of it. But that's not the world that we live in. The world that we live in is a world of iterated interactions, right? Multiple games played over very long spans of time with many people involved. And so there's an ethos that emerges out of that that's something like an ethos of fair play. And people abide by that, and it's because it's a deep instinct and it's a deep moral calling to be reciprocal, to treat other people as you would like to be treated. And that's a good antidote to the ethos of power. And it's part of a much deeper story, which is a story that I would say the people of Israel originated in large part. And so then let's talk about unity. Here's what unity does psychologically. You're either unified, which means you're pointed in a single direction and that your attentional priorities are linked towards some integrated aim, or you're aimless and hopeless and anxious. Because if you're scattered all over the place because you don't have a central narrative, then anxiety emerges to signal the fact that you have too many competing alternatives in front of you. You're disunified. Consequence, negative emotion, anxiety in particular, which signals entropy, which signals disunity. So that's a marker of not being unified. What's the other marker? Most of the positive emotion that you experience, we know this neurophysiologically, most of the positive emotion that you experience that makes life worth living, analgesic positive emotion, anxiolytic positive emotion, the positive emotion that gives you hope and curiosity and drives you forward, that's experienced in relationship to a unified goal. And the higher the goal, the more hope and positive emotion that's experienced as you view yourself making incremental progress towards the goal. So you need a unified goal that's transcendent in order to quell anxiety and to give you hope. And the technical details of that, I would say, are already laid out. So that's that's on the individual front. If you're not unified, which means in some sense that the ethos, the spirit that inhabits you is not, it's a plethora of deities rather than a monotheistic structure. If it's a plethora of deities rather than a monotheistic structure, you're anxious and hopeless because you're scattered all over the place. So what happens socially? Well, socially you're either unified or you're not. If you're not unified, then what are you? Well, you might be diverse, possibly, although you can have diversity and unity, which is what happens in a healthy and well-established family. But if you have no unity socially, then you have disunity. And if you have disunity socially, well, what do you have? You have confusion and hopelessness, and that degenerates into outright conflict. So without unity, the anxiety levels in this society and the hopelessness levels in this society mount to the point where people are at each other's throat. So no unity, no psychological health. No unity, no social peace and stability. And that's that. And that's why the contribution of the idea of monotheism was such a massive contribution. Because it was an intuition of the idea that all human motivations, all functions of perception, all forms of interaction had to be melded into something that had a transcendent unity that was posited out into the future, that constituted an aim and a psychologically uniting principle and a socially uniting spirit. And to the degree that we all abide by that socially unifying spirit, then we're sane and peaceful and productive and generous. And that's not the ethos of power, quite the contrary. So, with regards, okay, I've got one more thing to add to that, the story. So, what's the antithesis to the spirit of power? Well, that's partly what's laid out in the biblical corpus. So imagine that there is an a spirit that's antithetical to the spirit of power, maybe the spirit of deceit, maybe the spirit of pride, the catastrophic spirit of dissolution. It's a complex spirit because transcendent unity has to unite everything, and something that unites everything is very difficult to apprehend as a unity. And so what the biblical corpus does is it aggregates a set of micro-stories which are representations of the transcendent spirit that unites us psychologically and socially. That's the nature of the biblical corpus. And the human imagination, or God's divine providence, take your choice, has picked these stories because they each shine a characterological light on the nature of the spirit that unites us in the highest possible sense. So we can walk through that relatively quickly. So in the story of Adam and Eve, God is not least. And this is God as character, or God as model for ritual emulation, or God as central narrative figure. That's another way of thinking about it. God is the spirit that you walk with when you're not self-conscious in a well-tended garden. Okay, so why do you have a garden? Precisely so you can do that. To forget about yourself for a minute, to engage in the apprehension of something balanced and beautiful, a walled garden, the proper integration of culture and nature. And the proper apprehension in that situation frees you of your self-conscious burden. And so for a moment you enter that transcendent state that's associated with the Edenic paradise. So that's God in that story. Later in the story of Adam and Eve, God is the spirit that calls you to conscience when, like Adam and Eve, you've bitten off more than you can chew. In the story of Cain and Abel, God is the spirit of conscience that calls to you when you've made improper sacrifices and are facing the consequence of your unwillingness to go all in on your life. In the story of Noah, God is the spirit that calls to you, if you're wise, when trouble is coming, and you determine to batten down the hatches. In the story of Abraham, God is the spirit that calls the overprotected and unwilling, despite their resistance, out into the adventure of their life. In the story of Moses, God is the spirit that calls to those who are oppressed and in slavery to free themselves from the grip of tyranny, whether it's their psychological tyranny or whether it's the tyranny of the state. And so all of those stories point to an underlying transcendent unity of character, let's say, which is the proper model for worship and celebration and ritual emulation that's united, that's the antithesis to the, let's say, darker and more multiplicitous spirits that might rule the world. And part of the religious enterprise is the elaboration and understanding, and then the incorporation, ingestion, and modeling of that spirit in your own life. And to the degree that you do that, you do what the Logos did at the beginning of time in Genesis. You use truth, truthful speech, guided, let's say, by love, to confront the transforming horizon of the future, the chaos and potential of the transforming horizon of the future, and turn it into the habitable order that is good. And that's a manifestation of the image of God that man and women are made in. And responsibility. Responsibility, in some sense, that's maturity, but I would also say that's the adventure of your life. And how is that tied to the idea of sacrifice? Well, what do you have to sacrifice if you're responsible? And the answer is you have to sacrifice your short-term, hedonic, and immature whims, right? So if you're a child, if you're 2, you're impulsive, and that means that you only act for the moment, and you only act in relationship to what it is that you, as a singular individual, want in that moment. And that's just not a tenable solution to the complexities of life, because you don't just exist in a moment. You exist as an iterated set of identities across time. You yourself are a community that extends across time, and you have to govern every action that you take in the present in relationship to the fact that you can do what you want tonight, man, but you got to put up with yourself tomorrow morning, and you got to put up with yourself for what you did tonight next week and next year and 5 years from now. And every single one of your actions is like that. And so in order to act properly, you have to sacrifice the impulsive gratification and the easy way out that's characteristic of the moment, and extend yourself across time so that you are acting in concert with the highest interest of yourself in the broadest possible range of contexts. And that's what it means to be an adult. And you do exactly the same thing with other people. In a relationship, in a marriage, you're not just who you say you are from moment to moment. You have to negotiate very carefully with your wife or with your husband on an ongoing basis, every week, every moment in some sense while you're communicating, to understand not only how you can get what you need and you want, which may be necessary and important, especially in the long run, because you have to treat yourself properly, but so that you can do that in a way that your partner can also get what he or she needs and wants, in a way that makes both of you more likely to get what you need and want over the long span, and more so than you would get if you were alone. And if it wasn't the case, why would you bother with it? And then you have to incorporate children into that too, and that gets to be a more complex unity. So if there's 5 of you, well, how do you balance your individual needs and wants with that small collective? And that's the negotiation process that goes on in a family. And hopefully you do that too in the spirit of reciprocity and truth and love. And you take on that responsibility, and that's the core aspect of sacrifice. Right? The great discovery of the human race. That's what sacrifice means. And you sacrifice the foolishness of yourself. You sacrifice the momentary foolishness of yourself to the highest good that you can possibly imagine. And there's nothing in that that isn't good, even though it's difficult. And that's not mere inhibition of those impulsive gratifications that, if only were allowed to be manifest fully, would set you free. Quite the contrary. You would have precisely the freedom of an extremely badly behaved 2-year-old. And that's no freedom at all, right? All that is freedom to wander in the street and get crushed by the first car that drives by. And there's nothing in that that's proper, unless you're 2. And then only for a year. So story, unity, responsibility. So, what do we have to offer as an alternative to a story so pathological that it's almost impossible to comprehend? That story is one pixel representation of the world. It's all about power. It's like, that's great. You've summed up the whole world in one phrase, have you? You've been able to memorize that in your propaganda class in 1 minute. Now you have an explanation for every form of human interaction. You have a global explanation for the entire past and the present and the future. And not only that, by standing up against power, whatever that happens to be, you are now a saintly moral exemplar merely as a consequence of having swallowed this one lie. It's like, plus, it's so convenient, as I said before, on the moral front, that if it's all about power, then that justifies my use of power, because it's naive to think that there's anything else. Is there anything else? Yeah, there's plenty else. There's all the eternal verities. There's truth and beauty and love and justice. And there's the great stories that we've been telling to one another for immense spans of time that have guided our culture and shaped our perceptions and still continue to shape our perceptions in the most fundamental way. We need to understand these stories in a manner we haven't been able to understand them before, and to understand that they are describing the very means by which we perceive the world itself. And that the understanding, deeply contemplated by successive hundreds of generations of human beings, has winnowed out for us a pathway forward if we only have the imagination and the wherewithal and the moral courage to look and to listen and to understand, and most importantly to act out, to take on that responsibility, right? To confront the transforming horizon of the chaotic future. The unpredictable, chaotic future. All that infinite potential there. That's where the infinite and the finite meet, right? On the horizon of the future. And to chart our course forward, guided by the better story. And as Jews in Israel, are you telling the greatest story ever told? Well, you decide that by how you live. And that decision will affect the world, because everyone looks here for one reason or another. It's not so easy to understand. Everyone looks here to see, well, how are you actually doing under this tremendous assault of adversarial criticism, as this little tiny people in the middle of no man's land, in some real sense, as a, what would you say, cardinal model of the nation state and the city on the hill. You have a tremendous moral responsibility, like you have perhaps for your entire history, for reasons that are very difficult to understand. And I think it is true in some real sense that the fate of the world depends on the decisions of the people of Israel, just as the fate of the world depends just as the fate of the world depends on the decision of every individual. So you make yourself a shining light on the hill, right? You attract people here because of what you're capable of doing. You show the world what the holy city could look like, because we need it. We need it, and it's up to you to do it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson. I think the applause explained how we try to understand. Now for the debate, the conversation we will have now between Dr. Jordan Peterson. I would like to invite Ben Shapiro back to the stage. Beautiful. Many people speak about Jerusalem. Generations dreamt about Jerusalem for thousands of years. The brave ones had the honor and the right to fight for Jerusalem. And in honor of all these dreamers and all these fighters, only a handful have succeeded to give Jerusalem its international status it deserves. Ambassador David Friedman is one of those few who managed to return Jerusalem back into a city of peace. Making the world acknowledge the importance of Jerusalem and making peace on Jerusalem's behalf. Ambassador David Friedman, thank you very much for being here with us.